He wrapped the baby in his ex-wife's fur coat, buttons undone, as if still waiting for a familiar hand to fasten them. 3 days through the mountains, not to find a place to live, only to find a porch with a light that never went out. Somewhere he could lay the child down and vanish. At a cabin no one had ever knocked on, he collapsed, and a woman who wasn't waiting for anyone opened the door. They didn't ask names, they didn't tell stories, only the wind crept through the wooden walls. 3 breaths filled the room, one weary, one mute, one barely holding on. The baby didn't cry, but each time it shifted, both adults turned, as if afraid of losing something lighter than wind. Then, when a man from the past, who once tried to shoot him, arrived, it was the sleeping child's peace that made him turn away. Since then, the winters stayed cold, but in that wooden cabin at the forest's edge, 3 cups were always warm, and an old harmonica hummed each night as if someone had just found the breath they'd long forgotten. Part 1. The man wasn't looking for a way home, only a quiet place to die. The wind slithered through the cliffs like an old beast gone astray, wheezing thin breaths against the frozen earth. At the foot of the rocky pass, the sky held no blue, only a dull, leaden gray. Not quite day, not yet night. Everything in this borderland seemed suspended in between, including a man who walked without knowing why his feet still moved. His name was Jeb Carter, or had been. Those who once knew it had either forgotten or hoped never to hear it again. His coat was frayed at the shoulders, hem crusted with frozen mud, left arm wrapped in blood-stained bandages. But the only gesture in him that still clung to life was the way he held the child in his arms, not tight, but never letting go. A tired embrace, carrying the one thing left to hold on to, not for himself, but for the baby. The child wasn't his, and perhaps because of that, he was still alive, wrapped snug in a dull brown cloak, the kind women wear to market in winter. The last thing he took from the body of its mother, who had died 3 days earlier from a cold fever, while he could neither save her, nor bury her, nor cry. Since then he had walked, not to escape, not to arrive, just walked, each step cracking the dried mud beneath, the wind screaming in his ears, and the emptiness in his chest growing larger, as if the world had nothing left to offer except a baby who'd never called anyone father. The first night, he sat at the base of an old boundary post, where they used to hang bridles of wild horses. The second night, though by a dried-up stream, cupping cold water with trembling hands to warm the child's chest. By the third night, he couldn't sit anymore. Snow had started falling, not thick, but enough to make you lose feeling in your toes. Jeb slowed down. Each step left a deep print in the snow, erased within minutes by wind, as if no one had ever passed through. Then he saw it, light, faint, steady, tucked beneath a low wooden awning, the soft yellow of kerosene leaking through a door frame. Jeb didn't plan to enter, didn't think he could. But if there was a place warm enough, quiet enough to lay the child down, he would, and then move on, or stay there and disappear. Either way, he lifted a hand, knocked 3 times on the wooden door, not loud, more like fingernails brushing wet wood. Then he collapsed, not from hunger, not from fatigue, but because there was nothing left holding him up. Snow clung to his hair. His shoulders shook, not from the cold, but from trying to keep the child pressed to his chest, as if his final warmth could pass into a life that owed him nothing. No pleading, no voice whispering, please. Just a man crumpled on a stranger's porch, holding a baby asleep, its breath faint as cooling ash. He didn't believe anyone would open that door, but the door opened. Part 2, a door no one knocked on, but someone still opened. Inside the cabin, only a single kerosene lamp hung crooked from a beam. The north wall wept with old damp, the floor warped at the corner, where years of rain had crept through the roof. And yet the house still stood, because its owner, Martha Green, wasn't the kind of woman who let things fall apart without trying to patch them back together. She'd lived alone nearly 10 years. Each morning she lit the stove with wood split the previous season. She dried cloth by the window using soap made from old fat. Each afternoon she swept the front yard, though no one ever came, and each night she lit a lamp, though there was no one left needing it to find their way home. No one had called this house a home since the fever took her husband, and the tiny wooden clogs of the child, who never got to say mama. After the funeral, Martha didn't cry, didn't mourn aloud. She just went on living like soil hardening with each season. She never opened her door after dark, not ever. In these parts, knocks after sundown rarely brought good. But that night she heard knocking, 3 soft taps, as thin as a hem-brushing stone. She paused, not out of fear, but because something in her chest stirred very faintly, like wind rustling ashes thought long cold. She rose, walked to the door without hurry. When she opened it, she said nothing. A man lay collapsed on her porch, his body coated in snow like carved stone, but his arms, though limp, still cradled a newborn wrapped in a worn gray cloak. Martha stared a long time. The child didn't cry, didn't stir, but its chest rose and fell like a whisper. The man didn't look up, his head bowed, beard matted, as if he no longer belonged to any season at all. She didn't ask who they were, didn't ask where from, didn't think to ask the things normal people might. Instead, she took a half-step back, tilted one shoulder ever so slightly. Her hands remained folded at her chest, but her fingers had unclenched. The light behind her cast his shadow long across the snow, but that light was also the first thing to touch the baby's skin after 3 days of nothing but wind and torn flesh. Still, she said nothing, only stepped aside. A gesture so small no one else might have noticed, but it told the man all he needed. He wasn't being turned away. Jeb Carter raised his head slowly, not to beg, but because for the first time someone had seen him and hadn't turned their back. No hand reached out to help. But still, he stood and crossed that threshold, a place where no one invited him, but no one stopped him either. Part 3, a cabin with 3 breaths, one weary, one silent, one fragile. The door closed without a sound. The old wooden latch slid into place, not to keep anyone in, but to keep the wind out. Martha walked straight back inside, not looking behind her. She gave no gesture, no have a seat. Only bent down and added more wood to the stove. The fire flared up, then settled into a soft crackle, the sound she had lived with for a dozen winters without another soul beside her. Jeb Carter stood on the threshold a moment longer, not out of hesitation, but because he no longer knew where inside ended and outside began. His body trembled with each breath, uncertain whether it was cold, fatigue, or the strange ache of stepping into warmth without having to trade for it. He laid the child near the stove, gently, as if placing a snowflake on bare skin. The boy still breathed, but like someone afraid to draw too much air. His tiny face had gone pale, cheeks smudged with soot and dust, yet he curled into himself like a seedling pushing up through rock. Martha lifted the lid on a pot of bean stew, simmering since yesterday. She hadn't added anything new, hadn't taken anything out. But she scooped a small bowl and set it down on the floor beside the child. Not for the baby, not exactly for the man, just someone needed warming, and she was tired of the stove doing that job alone. Jeb didn't eat. but he knelt, unwinding the fabric wrapped around the boy. His hands were stiff, veins trembling, but he made no sound of complaint. When his fingers reached the innermost layer, he paused, as if afraid he might hurt something more delicate than he could bear. There were only 3 people in that house. Yet the silence was thick enough to hold all the ones who had gone before, the names once called in this space, the footsteps of children that had once run across these floors, now lived only in glances they both avoided meeting. Jeb sat down, back against the wooden wall. His body remained rigid, but his eyes had given up resisting. He gathered the child into his arms again, this time to warm them both, not to guard, but as if asking permission to keep going. Martha sat on a wooden chair near the stove, slowly rotating a chipped tin mug in her hands. She didn't look at him, but she placed a wool blanket, one that had once belonged to her son, close beside him. She said nothing, didn't mention it, but she had pulled it out from the chest beneath her bed, something she hadn't done in 8 years. Outside, the wind breathed against the eaves, sighing through the cracks in the walls, and inside that little cabin there were 3 breaths, one tired to the bone, one faint as smoke, and one still keeping rhythm, even without any clear reason to believe. No one asked names, no one told where they came from, but that night, no one left. Part 4, Old Habits Now. Quietly shared morning came late at the forest's edge. The frost clung to the grass, the cold seeped through the grain of the floorboards. Martha rose first, as always, pulling on the thick sweater she'd knitted the previous winter, her feet more used to the chill than to human presence. She lit the stove, placed the kettle on top, then took 2 tin mugs from the shelf, a habit so old her hands moved without thinking. Except this morning, she filled both. She didn't set it in front of anyone, didn't say, "This is for you." She just filled it and placed it on the edge of the wooden table across from her own. The firelight caught the rim of the cup, making the coffee look deep and dark, like a greeting that didn't need a name. Jeb sat in the corner. He hadn't slept all night, but he never complained. His face was still drawn, gray as ash, but something in his eyes had stopped collapsing inward. Maybe it was the child in his arms, still breathing, still alive. And maybe it was the heat of the stove, doing just what Martha had silently calculated it would the night before. He didn't reach for the coffee, but he looked at it for a long time, as if it had never occurred to him that someone might make something for him, without asking for blood, for words, or for a name long buried. The boy slept easier than he had the night before. Martha noticed, not by checking a thermometer, not by asking questions, but by watching the way all mothers watch, long enough to know when a child is okay. By midday, she went out back to check the chicken coop. The hinge had rusted, the door sagging out of its frame. She was used to fixing it herself. But before she touched it, Jeb appeared behind her. He said nothing, just knelt, took a small knife from his belt, and began shaving the latch back into shape. Each motion slow, steady, unshowy. Martha didn't ask when he learned to do that, didn't tell him to stop. She only stood there, arms folded, looking down, as if to say, "That's enough," without bothering to speak. That day she brought in more firewood than usual, stacked it by the door, for someone to use if they wanted. That night, as the wind howled through the rafters again, Martha heard the rear door latch click gently, not from the inside, but because Jeb had fixed the hinge. That tiny house, once filled only with wind and fire, now held other sounds, the soft tap of blade against wood, footsteps crossing the porch without waking anyone, the even breath of a child sleeping soundly. No one said, "You can stay." No one said, "I'll help you." But no one left, and the next morning when Martha poured the coffee again, the second cup was no longer full. Part 5. A child who never cried, still made grown people stay. Tommy wasn't a hard baby, but he wasn't easy either. He didn't cry at night, didn't smile during the day. He just slept. So much that Martha worried. The kind of sleep too still, too silent. The kind seen in sick children or in those who've long stopped waiting for anyone to soothe them. On the third night, Jeb stayed awake beside the crib. Not because he had to, but because he was afraid that if he closed his eyes, he'd open them to an empty blanket. He didn't know how to care for children, and Martha had forgotten how. The hands that once touched a feverish back, that once wiped a brow with warm cloth, now trembled as they unwrapped Tommy's little layers. The same hands that once held a full-grown man now hovered over a tiny wrist, afraid even a gentle grip would be too much. Tommy didn't say a word, but didn't need to. Each time he stirred, barely more than a leaf shifting in wind, both Jeb and Martha would turn to look, not to speak, just to see. Like someone searching for something they dropped, something impossibly fragile, using only their eyes. By the stove, Martha broke a piece of old bread, dipped it into warm milk, and placed a spoon to the baby's mouth. Tommy didn't react, but he swallowed. It was the first time she exhaled with ease. Jeb said nothing, but took one step closer. Just one. That day he chopped more wood, but for the first time he made 2 piles, one near the back door, the other beside the stove. No one asked why. No one pretended not to notice. That evening Martha didn't shut her bedroom door tight like usual. She left it slightly ajar so the light from the kitchen could spill through, just in case someone needed to pass without tripping in the dark. And the next morning, for the first time in 3 days, she saw Jeb asleep. Not slumped against the wall, not clutching a knife, just leaning beside the crib, his head tilted gently toward Tommy like a guard who'd finally let himself rest. Martha didn't wake him. She just poured coffee, this time, not out of habit, but because it felt necessary. Part 6. Snow wrapped tight around what no one dared ask. Outside, snow blanketed the roof like pale hands trying to hush the passing of time. The air stayed still. Only the wind slid through the cracks in the walls, a sound that didn't bite the skin, but the heart. In the wooden cabin with no clocks, time was measured by what they chose not to say. Jeb didn't speak of where he came from. Martha didn't ask why. He'd left. No one mentioned Tommy's mother. No one asked whose blood ran through the child, whether Jeb was kin or just a stranger who'd crossed paths at the wrong time. But it didn't matter. When a man has nothing left but a child in his arms, and a woman has nothing left but the silence in her home, sometimes a child's presence alone is enough to make 2 people stay standing. That morning, while shaking out a dry cloth, Martha found a small scrap of fabric near Tommy's crib, old, frayed, but stitched in red thread. A single letter so familiar she froze for a moment before recognizing it. E. Maybe Emma, maybe Elaine, maybe a wife who once embroidered something for her husband before a stove somewhere went cold for good. She didn't ask Jeb. He didn't explain. That evening, while he stacked firewood, Martha sat quietly by the lamp. She turned the fabric over in her hands, then reached for a needle and thread from an old box. Using gray thread this time, she added another letter beside the red one, a T. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't straight, but it was true. The next morning, Jeb found the cloth folded neatly by the crib. He touched it, paused, said nothing. But at dinner, he set another bowl on the table, 3 bowls, one large, one medium, one small. No one smiled. No one raised a cup, only the soft clink of spoons against porcelain, a sound not grand, but unmistakably an agreement. And so the winter gained a new fire, not blazing, not bright benched, but steady, carried quietly in small shared acts, enough to hold warmth for 3 souls who once believed they were lost for good. Part 7. A stranger who spoke with the voice of old shadows. It was a bleak noon, no rain, but the sky drooped in shades of ash, like the smoke of a long-dead fire still settling on the earth. The snow had not yet melted, but had lost its whiteness. No longer bright enough to sting the eyes, just dull enough to warn that something quiet had entered the edge of the woods. Then came the first hoofbeats, low, heavy, unhurried. Martha was collecting dry laundry from the line. The wind turned against her, flinging the tablecloth into her cheek. Like a warning, she looked up, her hands still clutching a child's sweater. Warm from the fire, between the pines a rider emerged. Black coat, large horse. Muddy hooves hardened by frost. No gun slung from the saddle, but the air around him still smelled of danger. Martha stepped inside. She didn't lock the door, didn't close it completely. She stood behind the curtain, eyes sliding through the fabric's weave. She wasn't afraid, but she was vigilant for all 3 of them. The man stopped his horse at the porch. No greeting, no question. He simply said a name. Jeb Carter. Not a shout, not anger, but his voice was dry as gravel, carrying like a bullet not yet fired. Jeb stepped out, neither slow nor rushed. His hand still held the ash from half-burnt firewood. No weapon on him, only an old hat worn deeper than time. 2 men stood there, one on the porch, one below it, in a land that belonged to neither. No old score was spoken aloud, no names of the dead exchanged, no demands made, only eyes met, and whatever needed knowing was already understood. The rider glanced inside, through the half-open door, saw a child asleep in a wooden crib, saw a woman behind a curtain holding a tiny wool sweater, and he turned his horse around. No word left behind, no warning, just hoofprints fading into the snow behind him. There was no exhale. No one said, "We're safe now." But that evening, when Martha brought the soup to the table, Jeb didn't look down like he usually did. He reached out, took the spoon from her hand, and for the first time their hands touched without pulling away. Dinner stayed quiet. The fire burned steady. The child slept soundly. But in that brief moment, something melted. Not the snow outside, but a small, silent piece of ice they'd carried within. Part 8. No one begged, yet mercy was given. After the hoofprints faded, the afternoon lingered longer than usual. Snow began to fall again on the wooden roof, thin as chalk dust. In the kitchen, the fire crackled, its rhythm calm like the heartbeat of someone who'd just reclaimed their breath after seasons of gasping. Jeb sat by the stove, his coat still carrying the scent of smoke. He didn't remove it, didn't wash his hands. He just sat, eyes low, facing the embers. Martha didn't ask anything. She ladled soup into the black iron pot, served it onto the wooden table like she did every night. She wiped the spoon with soft cloth, same motion as always. But this time she didn't set it down far from him. Her hands shook slightly from the heat as she brought the bowl to him. Jeb looked at the soup, then at her hands. No sound passed between them, but when he reached out and she didn't pull away, there was nothing left to say. They ate, facing each other but not opposing. Tommy slept in the crib, a thin blanket up to his chin, his face tilted toward the fire as if listening to its story. Jeb ate slowly. Martha didn't rush, just the soft clinks of spoon against bowl, like someone gently knocking on a door that might finally open. That night, for the first time, Jeb didn't sit guard. He lay down on the same blanket Martha had left that first night. Didn't lean his back against the wall, didn't clutch a blade. He simply placed one hand over his chest, as if to hold in something that had only just begun to stir again, in a chest far too used to emptiness. Outside, the wind still blew, snow still drifted through the pine ridge. But in a cabin at the edge of the woods, a man was learning how to sleep again, like a wild animal who'd finally found a cave quiet enough to rest his claws. No apologies were given, no questions were asked, no past stories were told, and that was what saved them. Because some people don't need their chains unlocked, they just need a place where no one speaks of shackles. Part 9. A house with footsteps lighter than wind. By the time winter lingered 1 week too long, snow had crept up to the windowsills. Frost traced the cracks in the glass like white hair on an old man's brow. One morning Martha rose earlier than usual. Her back bent as she scrubbed the floor. Not because of dust, but because someone was about to start walking. Tommy had learned to crawl. At first he smacked both hands on the wooden planks, lifted his head, rolled over, rolled again. Then, almost instinctively, slid himself toward the stove, toward the flicker of red light and the shadows it cast. Martha didn't call out, didn't shout for Jeb. She only watched, eyes brimming but lips pressed, as if holding back something unbearably soft. Jeb saw it. From his chair in the kitchen corner, he set down the knife he'd been using to peel an apple, stood slowly, and walked over. Said nothing, just picked up a piece of pale pine, planed one side smooth. Martha didn't ask what he was doing, but that afternoon, in the hush of the cabin, there appeared a tiny wooden horse, small enough to fit a child's palm, with curved legs and a proud neck. No one called each other mother, father. No one asked, "What are we to one another?" But the next morning, as Martha hung the wash, she tied her hair back with a faded strip of green cloth, soft, worn, long forgotten, in the back of a drawer. Today she tied it like someone who expected to be looked at for more than just a meal. That same morning Jeb had already split firewood before she spoke. He stacked it by the porch, neat and firm, as if he wanted this house to hold enough heat for all three of them. He swept the thin snow from the doorstep, tightened a loose hinge in the window, and stood quietly by the pane long after dusk had fallen. No one asked permission, no promises were spoken. They simply stayed and started living as if they'd shared breath through many winds already. In the firelight, the little wooden horse rested by Tommy's feet. The boy turned, grasped it with both hands, then let it go, as if testing whether it would return to him. Jeb smiled for the first time. The glow from the hearth lit his cheek, like wind brushing the face of a man who hadn't expected to smile again. Part 10. Winter begins to recede, but not every pain melts. February moved through town like an old wolf, gray-furred, dim-eyed, but still baring teeth. On Martha's roof, the snow no longer blanketed thick. Only streaks remained, thin as the final breath of a fading season. Jeb sat in the horse shed. He didn't mend anything, didn't feed the animals, just sat near the half-open door where the light fell across his knees, and paused on the object in his hands, an old harmonica, rust clinging to one edge, paint peeling. It had belonged to a boy who once called him Pa, not by blood, but by choice, a choice Jeb hadn't been strong enough to keep. He didn't play it, only turned it between his fingers, as if afraid that a single accidental note would call back every ache he'd never named. No one knew he had it, no one had ever touched it. But Martha, watching from the kitchen doorway, saw his silhouette leaning against the stable wall, like the shadow of a man who had lost everything, inside and out. The next morning, when Jeb came inside, the door was already open. Sunlight spilled onto the corner of the table, and there, on a clean cloth beside a bowl of warm water, lay the harmonica. No words, no "I saw," no "I know," just a gesture, small, quiet, enough to tell someone, You are no longer a stranger inside your own grief. Jeb picked it up, didn't say thank you, but he didn't hide it away again either. That night, between the flicker of oil lamp and the sighs of melting snow, music sounded, barely louder than breath. It wasn't a song, it wasn't in rhythm, just single stretched notes, like someone trying to remember how to exhale a sorrow without breaking into tears. Martha didn't look up, just kept washing dishes, hands trembling slightly. Not from cold, but because her heart had pulled tight, like a string just before it sings. Tommy slept soundly, lips gently closed, one hand still gripping the tail of the wooden horse. Outside, the wind brushed the eaves, soft and wandering. In that wooden house, no flowers, no photographs, no declarations of love, but something had begun to live again, and it didn't need a name. Part 11. Peace doesn't last, and it doesn't need to. To matter, March winds came with the scent of wet earth and the distant caw of scattered crows beyond the pines. On the porch, Jeb was mending the handle of an old water bucket. His hand steady, his eyes fogged by thoughts he couldn't name. Inside, Tommy slept in Martha's arms. She sat by the stove, stitching a patch into a blanket, each patient thread a silent prayer. Then came the sound of hooves, not frantic, not angry, but steady, inevitable. Jeb rose, set the hammer down, not rushing but not hiding either. 3 men on dark horses approached from the direction of town. The one in front, the same man who once came, stood at the door but chose not to shoot. This time he wasn't alone. No guns drawn, no shouting, just a thick stack of papers tied tight, and a gaze no longer cold, just hollow. Jeb stepped onto the porch. No coat, no gun. He stood in full view as if nothing left in him needed shielding. The rider dismounted, placed the papers on the wooden railing. No long explanation, just a nod and one step back. In his eyes, no more hate, only quiet acknowledgement. Debt, land, the names of the dead, and the rest of it. Jeb picked up the papers, sat on the porch steps, opened them one by one. The wind helped turn the rest. No one urged him, no one intruded. Martha stood inside, hand resting gently on Tommy's shoulder. She didn't step out, didn't speak, but stood firm, like a beam holding up the roof, unshaken. Jeb read for a long time, said nothing, just turned pages, and then he tore a corner from one. Then another and another. He fed them into the fire by the doorway, not in rage, not with proclamation, just a quiet refusal, from a man who'd long stopped living by other men's laws. The man who came to collect didn't react. He watched, turned, led his horse back the way he came. No gunfire, no one fell. Only ashes rose, pages undone like promises that were never meant to be signed. Inside, Martha drew Tommy closer, wrapped another layer around him, as if the wind outside still hadn't learned how to leave. Jeb stood at the threshold, dust of burnt paper clinging to his sleeves, his face unreadable, but his eyes still as water after a storm. Peace doesn't last, but it had come, and because it once existed, it became something worth guarding at any cost. Part 12. You don't have to be good, just don't leave each other again. The next afternoon, no snow fell, but the cold hung thick, so heavy that even the chimney smoke didn't bother rising. Jeb stood by the dry trough, his hands grinding against each other like he was trying to wash off something that no longer showed. Old blood, or mistakes without names, from a life long left behind. Behind him, the wooden door opened. Martha didn't step out, just stood in the frame, clutching a patched cloth in her hand. She had seen enough to know this was a man with nothing left to beg for, and no strength left to walk away again. Jeb didn't turn, but his voice, for the first time, oozed into air like bare feet touching early snow. I ruined everything I ever loved. He said it as a fact, not for pity, not for forgiveness. Then silence, brief, but not final. His voice returned, lower, rougher, like rotted wood beneath hardened bark. I'm not asking to be forgiven, just to try again. That was all. No tears, no collapse, just a man who had walked to the edge of loneliness and come back to knock softly on a door. Martha said nothing. Not from anger, not because she doubted, but because she knew. Words like that only need to be heard once, and then let action carry the rest. She turned, walked into the bedroom. Her hand trembled slightly, not from cold, but because it was the first time in years she'd done this. She opened the old wardrobe, the one her husband once used. Inside, wool shirts, folded scarves, and a small empty corner. She moved a few things aside, straightened them, then left half the space open. Enough for a few shirts, a scarf, maybe even a man who didn't know how to begin, but needed somewhere to stay. She didn't say, "You can put your things here." Didn't say, "I forgive you." Didn't ask, "What are we now?" She just left room. And anyone who's ever walked through the desert of loneliness knows leaving space is the gentlest language love can speak. That night, Jeb didn't say another word, but he placed his boots inside the door instead of leaving them on the porch, hung his coat beside Martha's rake instead of keeping it separate. And when he passed the bedroom, he paused. Not long, just enough to see the space left for him. He didn't touch it, didn't step in, only let his gaze rest there, and nodded quietly. It wasn't surrender nor apology, but a silent vow that this time, if someone needed him, he wouldn't disappear. Part 13. One morning, Tommy laughed, and the world suddenly held spring. That morning brought no snow, but the fog lay thick across the window panes, like memories left unwiped for too long. Martha rose early, as she always did, not to do anything grand, just to fold a few towels, warm the wash water, and neatly press a shirt belonging to someone who no longer felt like a stranger. The stove clicked softly, and in the wooden cabin, the warmth from the hearth spread out like a kind of peace that didn't need to be declared, only allowed to exist. Jeb was still in bed, or perhaps lying awake with his eyes closed, the way he'd learned to rest after too many years of guarding his own back in the dark. Tommy lay in a wooden crib, built from scraps Jeb had salvaged from the old workshop, not stirring, not fussing. Martha was folding cloth when she heard it, a sound both unfamiliar and utterly known. It was light, like wind chimes, sharp, like dry twigs snapping, and alive, so much so that she wondered if she'd imagined it. She turned and saw Jeb, seated on the floor, legs stretched forward, his hands clumsy as they steadied Tommy crawling over his knees. But the child wasn't just crawling. He was laughing, not a sleep smile, not a quiet grin, but a full, unhindered laugh, the kind that rises for no reason at all, except that something inside you says, joy must be let out. Tommy crawled to Jeb's worn boots, gripped the frayed tips with both hands, like he'd discovered treasure, and laughed again, loudly, as if trying to wake the whole house with his happiness. Jeb froze, stiff, lips pressed tight, as if even breathing too hard might make the laughter vanish. Martha stood in the doorway, still holding a towel, now pressed against her chest as if to stop her heart from tumbling out. Morning light spilled past her shoulder through the eaves and lingered on a strand of white hair she hadn't bothered tying back for days. No one said a word. They didn't need to. Tommy laughed, the kind of laugh that told the world, I chose the right house to open my voice in. And from now on, I won't be laughing alone. That moment wasn't captured in a photograph, not painted, not etched in any diary, It lived only in the heart of a woman who once thought her story had already closed, and in the eyes of a man who had long believed he no longer had the right to be called father, and in the gentle morning breeze, slipping through dried pinewood rafters, the cabin seemed to breathe a new rhythm, one that didn't need shared blood to feel like family. Part 14, they never said I love you, but stayed. As if they'd never left us, spring fully arrived on a bright morning when the clothesline out front fluttered with 3 pieces of laundry. One man's shirt, one old dress newly hemmed with lace, and one child's milk-colored shirt. They swayed together like the shared breath of a house that didn't need titles to be called a home. Out front, Tommy was learning to walk. He stepped slow, wobbled, tipped forward. His little arms flailed, and Jeb, a man who once lost everything, knelt down, arms wide, saying nothing, only letting his chest become the one place the boy could fall into. Tommy toppled forward, didn't cry, just nestled his head into that old leather coat, as if the scent of that man was something he'd known long before they met. Martha watched from the doorway, said nothing. She walked back inside, poured coffee, 3 cups, set them on the worn wooden table. No one asked, "Who's the third for?" It was just understood that this house now had 3 souls needing warmth in the morning. She rinsed all 3 cups afterward, her fingers brushing the cracked glaze with a tenderness as if afraid to break something not made of glass, but of trust, finally taking root after so much frost. Outside, the sky was so clear that even the first birds of spring dared to sing close to the window. The little cabin at the edge of the American West, where no one had to beg to stay and no one was told to go, stood quietly among the trees, like a seam that had been stitched gently into the torn fabric of a life. It didn't need to be seen by the world, only by the 3 people within who knew on some ordinary morning that someone once stopped walking, because a small gesture was enough to make them stay. In the wake of melting snow, no one is born to live alone. Only some have wandered through enough loss to forget how to knock, on their own heart or on someone else's. Jeb never promised to stay, and Martha never asked him to change. They simply let the days pass, shoveling snow, boiling eggs, brewing coffee, and in those quiet rituals, perhaps there lived a vow, unspoken, one no lips needed to shape. Tommy still doesn't know what to call them, but he's grown used to the heavy footsteps of that man each evening and the gentle, calloused hands of that woman each morning, and for a child, that is enough. It's more than a family. If you've ever found yourself in the silence of Jeb, or in Martha's quiet, undemanding gaze, if you've ever thought of leaving until a hand, without words, made you stay, leave something beneath this video. It doesn't have to be a sentence. A single dot will do, just to say, in this windswept land, we are never truly alone.